Hello and welcome to the Good Grief Festival. My name's Milly Chowles. I'm your host today, and I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today Robert Webb. Robert is, of course, an actor, comedian, writer, and alongside his comedy partner David Mitchell, has been a regular presence on our screens since the early noughties. He's starred in and written sitcoms and series like That Mitchell and Webb Look, Confetti, Back, and of course is possibly best known, certainly to me, as I just rewatched the entire series, for starring in the ever man boy, as man boy Jeremy in the iconic Peep Show. And he'll also have a special place in the nation's heart for his winning performance in comic relief Let's Dance. Certainly a special place in my heart too. And if all of that's just the tip of the iceberg, wasn't enough. He's now a best-selling author as well. He's written a memoir, How Not to Be a Boy, and also his first novel, Come Again, which was released earlier this year. Oh, there it is. And I would say it makes absolutely perfect reading for a second lockdown. And you can get it at the Festival Bookshop, available now at all other good bookshops as well. Is there anything else I haven't mentioned? No, that's it. Hello, Robert.
Hello, Milly. Thank you very much. That was a very handsome introduction.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know we're all very excited to hear you. Obviously, I've introduced you and sort of spoken about, all your comedy and writing and stuff, but that's not really why you're here today. We're here as this is the Good Grief Festival. You're also someone who's been impacted a lot in your life by bereavement, which we'll go on to talk about a little bit later. So I did want to ask you, without sounding too much like your shrink, to sort of set the scene for anyone who hasn't read How Not to Be a Book, How Not to Be a Book, How Not to Be a Boy.
That was the original title. Yeah. I thought it was a bit too self-deprecating.
Yeah, if you could set the scene and tell us a little bit about your childhood, where you grew up, and your family situation, that would be amazing.
Well, I come from Lincolnshire, which is the large and largely ignored county of the East Midlands, and I grew up in a little village called Woodhall Spa, and I have two older brothers. The main sort of focus of that part of the childhood memoir was the death of my mum, who died when I was 17. So we'd all lived together, and then my mum and dad divorced when I was 5. My mum remarried. We moved to another village, and then my mum died when I was 17. So that's right in the middle of the memoir, and that's the sort of central formative thing in the book, and also to some extent in my life. It's funny how you find, because a life doesn't really, most people's lives don't have a sort of 3-act structure. No one expects a memoir to work like that, but that was, it's interesting to me that I put that event right in the middle, in the longest chapter. So it was she got breast cancer and she died, it was really quite aggressive and quick. It was from I sort of found out, I was keeping a diary at the time, so I know that I found out in sort of mid-February, and she died at the end of April. So it was a very fast thing, which has its pros and cons.
I mean, it's hard. Yeah. So when you wrote the book, though, you weren't initially going to write it as a memoir. Is that right? It was more about this political kind of idea that you had about masculinity.
Yes, there's a preoccupation with masculinity, about how to the gender, the meaning that we give to sex, that how boys are supposed to be boys and how girls are supposed to be girls, and how that's a tough fit for a lot of people, and certainly I found it difficult lots of times, that boys were supposed to be gregarious and sort of cheeky and noisy, and they want to climb trees, and they're good at maths rather than English, and I couldn't do any of this. I was hopeless at football, and I was terrified. I lived in fear of wasps and nettles, and I was massively un-outdoorsy, and all the things that boys are supposed to love I was just frightened of. I talk also about my father. He was quite a frightening presence, certainly when I was younger. and just the expectations on boys and what masculinity expects from them, and how that leads to problems. And indeed, so when my mum died, for example, suddenly I was surrounded by people saying, look, and if you need to talk, just talk. I mean, I'm here if you need to talk. And while I was very grateful for the kindness, I experienced that as a strange kind of pressure, because suddenly I was expected to talk, but talk about what? Because boys are specifically trained not to talk. I mean, quite often I was hearing, and I wasn't the only one, hearing, about not expressing negative emotions, that you move on, switch it off, bottle it up, forget about it. We don't want to hear about your grief or your sadness or your embarrassment or your shame or boys don't cry. And suddenly I'm surrounded by people saying, so if you want to talk, just talk. And you're kind of going, well, what's the point of talking? Talking won't bring her back. Talking won't change things. And of course, talking doesn't change the events. But what it does do, as I found much later on, when I did start to talk about it, is that it helps you to make peace with the event, helps you to coexist with it, which is pretty much the most you can expect, or certainly that's as far as I got. You don't quite get over an event like that, but you can sort of live with it, but you're not going to get there by just ignoring it. You have to really sit with it for a while and really fathom what you've lost.
And obviously now, since you've written about grief, not only your own personal grief, but grief is a central theme in Come Again, now you're talking about it all the time. You're at things like this, and I was wondering
I'm obsessed with it. It seems to be. I don't know, for someone who most of the stuff that I've written, and certainly as a performer, is to do with comedy, is to do with making people laugh. And so it's odd that this seems to be my subject or my preoccupation in 2 books out of 2. I mean, who knows? Maybe a second novel, it'll cheer up. But I've always believed that comedy can approach serious subjects, and in fact, sometimes you can say serious things in a funny way, and you can reach places that somberness wouldn't necessarily get to. A joke can get underneath people's skin in a way that a flatter approach can't. So I've always believed, and ever since I started working with David Mitchell, it was almost a sort of manifesto that if it's a fit subject for drama, it's a fit subject for comedy. You just have to be careful. You just have to be aware of what the joke's doing, whose side is this joke on, and how does it work, who are we laughing at, if anyone. But once you're confident about that, then you can make a joke about anything. And the way that Come Again works is that you have this central character, our heroine Kate, has lost her husband, and one day she wakes up. They met a long time ago. They met when they were kids, when they first got to university in Freshers Week. But she's about 45 now. She just lost Luke. One day she wakes up. She's 18 years old. She remembers everything. It's 1992. It's Freshers Week. This was the week that she met Luke for the first time. What do you do? So that's inherently, because she knows how he died. She thinks she's there to save him. She's going to try and do everything exactly the same. Hence comedy. So finally comedy makes an appearance, because of course you can't do everything exactly the same. So the premise is there. I didn't have to try too hard to sort of lever the jokes in, because the premise kind of quietly takes care of that. You've got someone who's 45 in her head, in the body of an 18-year-old, surrounded by not just her future dead husband, who is of course not the man that she lost. He's the annoying English student that she first met. And also the teenage versions of all of her lifelong friends. So she has foreknowledge of not just the future, but their individual futures. And so little ironies and things just pop up out of everywhere. So I tried to mind that for all it was worth.
It starts, the first part of the book is kind of her losing her husband and being so kind of low, and it's a visceral sort of portrait of grief. You really feel it, although that you do also manage to get laughs in there. So it doesn't feel that heavy, but it is heavy, but there's still laughter in there, there's still lightness. I guess like the book I read could be read as a metaphor for grief in a way, that it's the different stages. Did you intend that? Am I reading that right, or am I putting my own spin on it?
That's a very sensitive reading. That's exactly what I was doing. She basically has to. She's stuck in the past, which is what grief can feel like, particularly if you lose someone that you live with. Everywhere you turn, you kind of experience their absence almost as a presence. That's how I felt when Mum died. That she was just present in the hum of the fridge and the squeak of the sofa, and everywhere you turn is like Groundhog Day. That suddenly there are no new experiences. That every discovery is kind of dead on arrival, and you feel that you're stuck in the past. Everything reminds you of the past. Kate literally has to go and live in the past in order to discover or to remember how the present has something to say for itself, has something to offer. And she has to live in the past in order to re-engage with the present. And that's what she does. She goes back there, she makes some certain discoveries, which I won't go into, but then she comes back to the present. And it's the difference between grief and mourning, basically. Grief is where you're stuck in the past. Mourning comes later, and that's the good stuff. That's the grief has no meaning. Mourning is where you start to find meaning. You start to reintegrate the lost past with the new present. And that's where you start to get better.
Yeah, and she explodes back to life. Am I allowed to say that without it being
yes,
much of a
yes,
spoiler?
she does. Yeah,
in a glorious way.
Hopefully, the reader's been spending the first 2/3 of the book thinking when this woman gets her shit together, it's going to be a sight to see. And she explodes back into life. Exactly.
Yeah. So, if you don't mind, we can go back to your own personal story. Losing your mum at 17, I mean, that's such a huge thing for anyone to take on, and there's a scene in it where you find out that she's terminal, and it's heart-wrenching, and you talk about how you're processing it, and then you talk about how your dad is there processing it with your stepmom, and you also talk about that you sort of lash out at a girl that you fancy, and it's like this portrait of men of a different generation who obviously just can't handle the emotion that they're faced with, and how it kind of comes out. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, she'd been very ill for weeks and in bed for weeks, and but I hadn't asked anybody what was going on, and nobody had told me, and I didn't, I didn't want to ask in a kind of superstitious way that somehow if I brought up the subject of when are you going to get better, are you going to get better, that would somehow tempt the worst. So nobody had said anything. And I came home from school one day. It was the beginning of my lower sixth, and I came home from school, and Dad's van was there, and Dad and my stepdad Derek were sitting next to each other at the kitchen table, which was a very novel sight, not a welcome one. And Dad had a couple of drinks, and he said, "Now, boy, your mum's poorly. It's terminal." And then he immediately started talking to Derek about, you're probably going to have to get a cleaner, Derek, because it's hard, isn't it? It's hard keeping a place clean. And Derek started haggling about, how much it would cost to pay a cleaner, while I just quietly started crying. It was just these two blokes who, it was just pure transference, or whatever the term is, but, or just disengagement. They had to start talking about something completely different. Anyway, later I got to have a conversation with Mum, and she said, "I'm sorry, that was a horrible way to find out. That's Paul being a bloody nuisance as usual, and I should have told you myself." And then we got to have a conversation. But the finding out day was easily the worst day of the whole process. It was worse than the day she died. It was worse than the funeral. It was worse than the months that followed, and all of that was quite tough, but it was nothing compared to that moment where you just have it broken to you in the dumbest possible way. That's the new situation.
And I guess what I kind of got from that was, you also talk about it in that time, like you lashed out at a girl that you fancied. You wrote her a.
I did. Can I just say I didn't physically lash
out?
out?
No, sorry, no. In terms of
it's starting to make it sound like
no.
It was no. I wrote a nasty letter because
Yeah.
A girl that I'd been trying to go out with for ages. One night we were at some party. I mean, the weird thing is, it was a horrible time and a terrible year, but at the same time, 17 was also a brilliant year. Because, every weekend somebody had an 18th birthday party, and I just passed my driving test, and I had later on, not at this point, but later on, I had my first girlfriend, and, it was sort of the best of times, as well as, this terrible thing going on. I listened to the music of 1990, which was that year, and, I love it. It was all very exciting. But anyway, there was some party, and I was trying to go out with this girl, trying to go out with this girl, and she finally got her friend to come up and tell me, can we just be friends? And I wrote this incredibly pompous and hurt letter to her about how could she possibly be so insensitive and treat my feelings, yada yada, self-absorbed 17-year-old thing. But it was looking back. And sort of tallying the dates of that letter with the diary entries, this was like, a week later, a week after Mama died, or it was a week before. But I knew that, something really horrible was going on, and I kind of took it out on the girl, and that kind of fits in with some of the stuff that I was saying about masculinity, which is that you're not allowed to express negative emotions except for anger. But for some reason, anger, you get it. That's okay. So quite often you find yourself being angry when what you're actually feeling is grief, or angry when what you're actually feeling is shame, or you're angry when you're humiliated, or you're angry when, any other sort of bad things that you're not allowed to sort of talk about, but you are somehow allowed to be angry.
Yeah, and that really hit me. I think that's one of the kind of takeaway sentences or kind of thoughts that I had from the book, was this idea that, that we tell boys not to talk about things, and then you hear, actually, you shouldn't feel this thing. So if you don't feel it, then you kind of, and then eventually you just make it someone else's problem, basically. And you can kind of see that, I can see that so clearly now that you.
Yeah, it becomes you start to say, don't express these feelings. So often it starts uncannily like, don't feel these feelings, and so you bottle it up until you don't have to take responsibility for these feelings, and eventually it becomes, your mother's problem, your sister's problem, your wife's problem, your girlfriend's problem, heaven forbid, your daughter's problem. But it's usually women who are left to pick up the women you share your life with, who are left to pick up the pieces. This is not all men. And this is not all the time. And, women are perfectly capable of being unself-aware as well. But I do think that boys are literally trained not to talk about their feelings, and emotional literacy just isn't valued at all in boys, in the way that girls are allowed to talk to each other about what's going on.
Yeah, and you described your dad in the book as a walking powder keg of repressed grief, and I was just wondering what you kind of meant by that, and what did you see when you saw repressed grief? How was it manifesting in him?
Anger and substance abuse. I mean, I talk about my own how much I was drinking by the time I became a father. And I mean, when I say substance abuse, it sounds ridiculously anachronistic. All we're talking about is someone around in the 1970s who finished work and went down the pub, had 3 pints, came home a bit pissed and in a bad mood and feeling a bit impatient with having a young family, and punished his boys physically when they stepped out of line. None of this was remotely unusual. And it's very odd to use these sort of jargony words, but he caused a lot of pain, and we were all really frightened of it. And that's not ideal. And part of the grief was to do with mum and dad lost their first child. Now that, as a father of two, is almost unimaginably hard. My oldest brother Martin died of meningitis when he was 6. and I was born 10 months later. So I've always felt that I was lucky and particularly wanted. And I think that's partly why I was so close to mum. But again, dad, just won't have had the resources to discuss that with anybody. I don't even know if they, it was completely beyond me whether they even talked to each other much about it. But to have something so horrifying happen, but not be equipped to talk about it or to process it. I mean, that generation, mum and dad's generation, boomers, basically, they are all the sons and daughters of soldiers. If you think about it, they're brought up by people who necessarily had to, just get on with it. And they didn't get support when they came home. So you get this sort of ongoing generational thing where we just can't talk about this stuff, and I just believe that that it's the magic bullet, that talking, even though it doesn't feel it's particularly helping in the long run, even in the medium term, it really does help a lot.
And as you say, you had this sort of very close relationship with your mum, which makes it all the more, painful. It's always incredibly painful, but and she used to read you stories, and you had this very kind of close bond, and that was obviously a huge influence on you. Do you think? How do you think do you think that relationship sort of formed you in some way? That closeness with your mum. Did you have a sort of you said in the book you had a slightly uncomfortable relationship with being a mummy's boy?
Yeah, again, there's no female equivalent, is there? There's mummy's girl. That's fine, isn't it? But somehow there's a rite of passage that I resisted, where you're supposed to start despising your mother. You're supposed to start kind of patronizing her, dismissing her. You notice that she's a woman. And so, I can't be bothered. I'm not spending time with my mum. What? And I sort of didn't do that. I was sort of happy. I really liked her company, and I didn't want to be a pain in the arse to her. As a teenage boy, I was perfectly happy hanging out with my mum, and it's not like anybody. I don't think anybody particularly called me a mummy's boy, but I was slightly ashamed of that friendship, because it wasn't really what I was supposed to do. Now, I know there are lots of boys who are close to their mums, but I'm not saying I'm unique in any way, but I think it's really weird that I was kind of made to be embarrassed by it. She was the sort of she was the indispensable parent, really. She was the kind of solid thing in the middle of everything else shifting. So that's why losing her was such a big deal. But then life goes on, and so you learn to adapt. But that was partly why it was hard. It was also hard, the timing. It could have been worse. I think losing a parent when you're 8 must be worse than when you're 17, or something like that. But it felt like we had just started to have a sort of grown-up relationship, and we just started to have conversations. So that's why it felt particularly cruel for her to sort of disappear at that point. But
yeah. Also, I feel like you said, 17 is such a special year. I think back to, 17 was a really special, sort of significant year for me. It's that kind of becoming an adult and sort of coming into your own. So it should be the best year of your life, and yet it was the worst year of your life. When you had found out that your mum was terminal, you also talk in the book about this sort of, suddenly you were besieged by a stream of visitors, and I just wanted to know, it all sounded incredibly unhelpful, to be honest, and insensitive, a lot of it, apart from Carol, wonderful Carol, who really exemplified how to support someone in the situation. What, I guess you can kind of, the do's and don'ts of supporting someone in the situation that you found yourself in.
Yeah, well, I say in the book that she found, Mum found herself with this new job, which was host. that if you're terminally ill, suddenly and people are coming around and she's telling Derek where to find a vase for the flowers, and she was getting out of bed, and so she didn't want to be found in bed. So she was sitting up in a wheelchair, and I could see that it was costing her physically. And I think in that section of the book, I was pretty unkind, really, about, I say something like, and here they come, the well-wishers and the do-gooders, and the people who, are so close to us, they need directions to find the bungalow. And it's quite mean, really, but I wasn't feeling very generous. I'm just reflecting how I felt at the time, which was not generous towards these kind of people and it felt ghoulish, it felt intrusive, people we just hadn't seen for literally years. They weren't friends, they were acquaintances, and they would sort of turn up with. So it was, I resented that on Mom's behalf. Carol, who was a good friend that she worked with, his mum was a secretary at a hotel, and Carol owned the hotel, and Carol would come around. She wouldn't flap, she didn't showboat, it was very quiet. She would do practical things. She would bring around a homemade lasagna, she would bring around food, she would quietly organize things. When Derek got ill under the strain, Carol took over. She was there with we had Marie Curie nurses, and Carol would coordinate that stuff. And it was just the model of someone just getting in there and helping. I mean, I did nothing. I was 17 and a boy. I wasn't expected to wash my own clothes. Never mind. I just look back and go, what did you do to help? And I didn't really do anything. I wasn't again, it just wasn't expected of me. But I was there. I talked to Mum, held her hand, and things like that. But I feel mean, really, having a go at the well-wishers, because, of course they want to come and say goodbye. I mean, they didn't say, we're coming to say goodbye. They came and said, we just wanted to pop in and say hello.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people needing to pop in and say hello. I think I read other people, under these circumstances, that they say, if you're wondering whether or not to write, do write. I think that's but as for actually showing up, it depends how much you're willing to make life easy for the people you're showing up, the doorsteps that you're showing up on. I mean, don't let them make you a cup of tea. Just, if you turn up, then get in there and put the kettle on yourself. People know.
Do some cleaning as well.
Maybe. Do some cleaning. I mean, a year ago to tonight, I was going into hospital I had to have a heart surgery because I had a failed heart valve, and then I was. It was quite a big deal operation. It's open heart surgery. It was quite a big deal operation. And friends came round, I asked them not to visit the hospital, but then after a week in hospital, I came home and people came, and, the friends that got top scores were the ones who came around with stuff to put in the freezer. So that Abby, my wife, didn't have to keep cooking everything because I couldn't do any cooking. And so, she was doing all that. So it's, the friends who get top scores are the ones who come around with a cottage pie. If you haven't got a cottage pie, don't bother.
And there's a book I read called Late Fragments, written by someone as they were dying from cancer. And Kate Gross, who I
reviewed it for the New Statesman. It's a fantastic book.
It's an incredible book, isn't it? And I was actually at school with her, and we went to drama school together.
Wow. She seemed like a really nice person.
She's incredible. And but the bit from that really stood out was the spiral. So at the centre of the spirals, there's your close friends and family, and then it's like your sort of immediate family, wider family. Then it's sort of colleagues and current friends, going back out to like old friends and old acquaintances. And basically, you never turn inwards; you always turn outwards for support. So you must always show a good kind of strong face inwards, and basically if you're on the outer edge of the circle, as you say, just write. Like, there's a million people further in than you who need that visit, and it's exhausting, and always sign off with a no need to reply as well. No, I think that's important as well. No, that's brilliant. That the rule of you're allowed to cry on someone in an outer circle, but you don't cry on the person, so I don't cry on the person who's dying, but I'm allowed to cry on
the person, my friends, but my friends don't get to cry on me.
Yeah.
So it's that, sometimes you having, said this stuff about masculinity and man up and be a man and don't show any emotions. Of course, there are times when you need to, but there are also times when you do have to be strong for the person who's in trouble.
Yeah.
You can be the wall that grief breaks on, but then as long as you get to pass it on to someone else. So it's it's a tricky thing to navigate. Some people just do it instinctively. I didn't, I wouldn't give myself particularly high marks, at the time. My excuse is I was basically a child, but it's not something you really want to get good at, is it? But
No.
But
yeah,
it's gonna, it comes to everyone, and so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think so many people are very scared and very uncomfortable, kind of even contemplating, approaching or talking about death, dying, grief, mourning. All these subjects feel so very frightening. And the more that we can talk about them as we are now, and as have you have done so brilliantly in your books. And, for example, those other examples, like, these books help people to broach the subject, to come together rather than, separate. So yes, hopefully doing a little bit more of that with this festival and helping people to kind of, to talk about it more openly. And thank you for obviously for writing your books and helping people through that.
No, it's a great pleasure. I think you can never say often enough that you're not alone, and that was definitely the part of the motivation of writing those parts of the memoir, and indeed that aspect of the novel is it's not a kind of, oh dear poor me kind of thing. It's an outward facing, hopefully generous act of communication. You want to tell people it's not just you. I've been through that, and loads of people have been through that, and it comes to us all. And so it's really important, especially in those first days, weeks, months, to know that it's not just you, and this happens all the time, and it's so common. And everybody, as REM said, everybody hurts. So the more we get to share it, the healthier I think it is.
Yeah, 100%. And that actually brings us seamlessly on to questions from the audience. So I'm just going to change iPads quickly. So we've got loads of questions actually to get through. Ellis says, I've repressed a particularly horrific loss, but my inability to deal with it has led to anxiety, depression, sleep paralysis. What do you personally feel constitutes healthy grieving?
Well, blimey, you should ask a proper shrink, really. I mean, I'd say, first of all, I'd say if you've noticed that you've repressed it, you're already surely halfway there. But people who are really in trouble are people who don't know that they're doing that. So the fact that you're aware of that you've been avoiding it is a good first step. I'd have thought. I mean, I hesitate to recommend it because I know how lucky I was that it was available to me. When I got to university, and something fairly trivial happened, and I ended up basically not being able to get out of bed or eat for a couple of weeks, and I started having suicidal thoughts, and I ended up going to the university counselling service. There was quite a long wait, but it was there, and I eventually went there. Now, counselling, it's not, you're not going to get a counsellor as opposed to a psychiatrist is really mainly going to just listen. They will occasionally draw things together, but they're really there to listen. The value of it for me was that I knew that, okay, here's a really unpleasant experience in my head right now, but at least I get to talk about it with Michael on Thursday. And that made all the difference, actually. And, he's not your friend. You don't have to worry about his time, that you're being self-indulgent, that you're taking anything from him. It's literally his job. He's got nothing better to do than to listen to you talking about your feelings, even though it feels very difficult to start. Even me, and I thought of myself as quite a touchy-feely, open kind of person. But me, age 20, you turn up at the counselling service, and he made us both a coffee, and then we'd walk upstairs, and there was a very childish part of me. You'll have to forgive the homophobic slur, thinking, this is so gay. I'm going upstairs to talk to another man about my feelings. Oh my God. It would actually be less gay if we were going upstairs to have sex. At least that would be doing something. So, it was the thing that I specifically trained not to do, which is to talk to another man about my feelings. So I do understand that it feels scary, but it's really easy once you start doing it. And you're not under any pressure to be miserable. You're not under any pressure to be cheerful. You just start talking about what's been bothering you, and a counselor. So it's not, to do it privately is very expensive. I know it's very difficult to get on the NHS. So that's why it's not going to work out for everyone. But I think that's always a useful thing. There are books that I'm sure the resources on this website, the Good Grief Festival, can recommend things to read, and if you've got a mate or two, then you'll always be surprised at who is ready to listen once you ask them to. Your friends always surprise you like that. They'll be better at it than you think.
Yeah, some definitely lots of great resources on this website. So if you've turned up at the Good Grief Festival, I think you've already made the first step. Next question is from Rosie. And Rosie says, I lost my husband to COVID in March and my two sons who are 25 and 29. And my two sons who are 25 and 29 seem able to discuss their emotions with me and friends. Does Robert think things have changed now for boys?
One would hope so. I really, really hope so. I mean, I'm kind of out of the loop really, because my book was really just talking about me in Lincolnshire in the 1980s. So, these things are difficult to measure. I would hope that things have improved. I remember a few years ago, Prince William, or was it Harry, or both of them, talked about how it's important to discuss these things and emotional literacy and not bottling things up. And I thought, well, actually, if the news has got that far up the repression chain, right up to the royal family, that family not known for their emotional literacy, then I think things clearly are changing. So I'm delighted to hear. I'm very sorry for your loss, but I'm delighted to hear that the boys are talking. Hopefully things are improving.
Yeah. The next question is from someone who's calling themselves Superhands. Have you been able to channel your experience around grief into any of your on-screen characters?
No. There are times when you're required to cry. I mean, in Peep Show, it was always for laughs. But there are a couple of times more on stage, actually, that if something sad happens, it's one of the few methody things that I do. Normally, you don't particularly use your own experience. I'm not the kind of actor who does use his own experiences. But sometimes, if I need to be sad about something, yes, I will. I'll go back to certain rooms and certain times, but I think on screen it doesn't happen very often when I need to. I'm not in those kinds of, unlike what I write as a performer, it's hasn't come up very often.
The next question is, have you had therapy? We spoke about the counselling that you'd had, but the question was, have you had any therapy, and has that helped you to put any healthy coping mechanisms into place? So I had that bit of counselling, and then I've seen other therapists. I had problems I was drinking a lot and smoking a lot, and I saw more than one therapist about that, and they were interested in, actually one of them was basically CBT, and he wasn't really very interested in my childhood at all. I was kind of disappointed. I wanted to talk, but then another one was, my answer is the coping mechanisms that I put in place were absolutely useless and hopeless coping mechanisms, namely cigarettes and alcohol, and I used those drugs quite heavily for the last 10 years. I mean, since I was a teenager, but with increasing heaviness over the last few years, until I gave up a year ago when I had this operation. Then I emerged with a newfound respect for my internal organs. But in terms of coping mechanisms, no, I was never taught any.
I mean, I've had mindfulness techniques recommended to me. I've had people say, "Have you tried this or that?" And reading about Stoics, reading about Stoic philosophy, just gratefulness and generally trying to be humble and trying to kind of walk around going, look at this flower. Don't just walk by the flower and just appreciate, just being present in the moment. All of those stuff, I can say these are all useful things to. This all sounds like good advice. I can't claim that I do much of it, but I have stopped poisoning myself, and life is considerably better now. Exercise is another thing. Living inside your body, being in your body, much more as often as you can, really, is hugely important and something I'd completely neglected. So yeah, no, I run every day now and stuff like that. So yeah, that was what I'd say.
Thank you. And Jill has said, how do you think losing your... Oh, no, that question's gone. Vicky says, how did your dad feel about what you wrote about him in your book?
Oh, he'd gone. There was no way I was going to write that book when he was still around. He died in 2013. He had emphysema and prostate cancer. His doctor told him one of them was going to get him if the other one didn't. It was a question of which one was first. So Dad wasn't around. It wasn't just sheer cowardice on my part, although partly, but also it would have just been mean because I had to, I didn't want to lie. I didn't want to be, but then I didn't want to be unnecessarily cruel. So it just wasn't a book that could have been written while he was around. By the way, I do redeem him. There were lots of things to admire about Paul, and you'll find in the second half of the book, that's all there as well. He was straightforwardly kind. His neighbors all loved him. He was very popular, very charismatic, funny man. There was a lot. I loved him. But I had to start at the beginning, and the beginning was not him at his best. So anyway, he didn't have to worry about that book because he'd gone by then.
So we have just time for one more question, and it's: do you think that? So the question is: has your loss changed your approach to parenting? I lost my dad a year ago just as he was forming a relationship with my infant son, and have just struggled to work out how to talk about him and to keep his memory alive for my son. And actually in the book you did say, in the last bit, that when your daughters were born, that it kind of triggered something in you, and often it does. I think parenting does bring up all sorts of issues from our own childhood. So how do you think it's changed your approach to parenting, and how do you broach the subject with your daughters?
It's difficult to say how it's changed my approach because there's no control experiment. This massive thing happened when I was 17, and I can't possibly imagine what kind of person I would be if it hadn't. It didn't. I don't subscribe to this kind of whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger kind of thing. I think it caused harm, it caused damage, but that's okay. We're all a bit wonky in various ways. It doesn't mean you're going to hurt other people. You just have to sort of keep an eye on it. How did it? So in terms of what I tell the children about this grandmother that they don't know, I mean, I tell them, she was terrific, and they're very sort of sorry for me, but they've never had that grandmother, so it's not like they miss her. They've vaguely, Ezzy, our oldest, who's 11 now, she has a vague memory of Paul, of my dad, and of Derek, my stepdad, also no longer with us. It's I mean, they get that people die, but so far they haven't had to experience. They haven't lost anyone close yet. Like Abby's family, for example, are still very much with us. So we've never had any pets. So we haven't had the dead pet thing yet. So I'll be there when something happens, but I'll probably say some of the things that I've been saying today.
And your approach would be to be open and honest, and actually that you also talked about not being invited to your nan's funeral, and I remember that as a child, not being invited to the funeral, being deemed too young, but actually you just sort of feel that as an exclusion, don't you, as a child? And
Yeah, I thought that was a bit, I was 12. I thought that was a bit wrong that I was sent to sort of a friend's house for tea while they did the funeral. Yeah, I think 12 is certainly old enough to deal with that. The funerals have, it depends who's doing it and how it goes, but it's not always going to be a brilliant cathartic experience that heals everybody. It's probably it's going to be a slightly stressful, slightly rubbish party that you have to go through. But there is a certain, they do, the reason we do it is because it offers the beginning of a sense of closure. And, it's really odd because you need, for it to go well, you need someone with some talent to be doing that. If somebody's written the eulogy and they've really got the person that you're talking about and they're able to make you laugh and make you cry in a good way, that's really going to help. If it's just some unfortunate vicar who's been given a piece of paper with the outline of someone's biography on it and he's never met them because nobody goes to church anymore, and he's haplessly reading out this potted digest of their life, what's the you'd be forgiven for thinking, what the hell is the point of this? So it can wildly vary about the quality of the funeral will really affect the whether it's actually going to do any good or not. But we have to go through them whether they're well done or not.
it might be a ripe subject for comedy, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there were quite a few comic novels that start at funerals, actually, and not just comic novels. Plenty of novels. It's always a good starting off point.
Yeah,
and
actually,
of course they're absolutely ripe for comedy because it's the thing where you absolutely must not laugh. I must say, at my mother's funeral, I didn't feel like laughing, but I've been at other people's funerals where I very nearly got the giggles, and I think that's fairly common actually, because it's just like being at school and you absolutely, of course, when you absolutely must not laugh, that's when you're at your most vulnerable. Yeah,
and we do it. Nervous laughter is such a human thing as well. At just the wrong moment, always. Robert, we've come up to time now, and I just want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and to everyone who's watching at home, please do go to the festival bookshop, get the books. They're absolutely brilliant, and you will laugh and also maybe learn something, relate to something about grief as well. And yes, and there's another day programming tomorrow, and all the resources on the website. So yeah, thank you so much, Robert.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you very much for having me. Have a great night.